Hi, I'm Barb Schweitzer. Thanks for coming to Wireframe Beads on Beaducation.com. The project that you're going to learn today is a really simple, great technique for beginners, and it's still fun for intermediate and advanced wire workers. You can use the technique to make pendants like the one I'm wearing, or beads as shown in the video, and the beads can also work as pendants. So the materials for today's project: bead caps, frame material, a bead mix including 4, 6, and some 3mm beads, 30 gauge wire, and a few daisy spacers. The frame material is 1/2-inch hardware cloth. It's a readily available hardware store material, and there are details in your handout about cutting it, or you can order more from Beaducation.com. This size is for the small bead, and this size is for the large bead, and you have an option to make either size. The caps are sterling silver and were made in Israel. They're custom sized 15mm on the inside of the cap so that they fit onto the beads perfectly. They were designed for the beads. The tools for this project are very simple: a pair of chain nose pliers and some cutters. You might want to use a pair of older pliers for this, since the material we're using is steel, so it might scratch if you've got better pliers. When you look at your frame material, there's a long horizontal and there are short verticals that cross over. Looking at it from the side, you can see that the vertical wires sit to one side of the horizontal wires. When you bend this frame, you're going to want to make sure that these vertical wires end up on the outside of the bead. To begin, line the blade of your chain nose plier right next to one of the vertical wires and bend away from yourself. Move to the next wire over and repeat. Move to the next one and repeat again until you've closed it up pretty much into a square. When you first finish it, you can see it's a little bit off. So you need to get in and do a little bit of reshaping. To flatten out any curves like you see here, I stick the frame all the way into the back of my plier jaw and squeeze flat, and then push the frame back down. And you can see that straightens it and flattens it quite a bit and changes the overall shape of this frame. Cut yourself a piece of 30 gauge wire no more than 2 feet long. If the wire's too long, it tends to kink a lot more. Fold it in half so that the center is wrapped around the frame. Then tie the first part of a regular knot and pull it down snug onto one of the frame wires. It doesn't actually matter which wire you tie it onto to start with. As you start to string the beads onto this frame, what you need to keep in mind is that the seam where the 2 wires come together to close the bead need to remain on the side of the bead, so that when you add the cap, it will be perpendicular to where that seam is. To start adding beads, I'm just going to string them onto the wire. I'm putting on a 6mm, a daisy, and a 3 to 4mm size bead. Pulling straight across from where I started, I want to check the fit and make sure there's a little gap between where the beads stop and where the frame is. Then I'm going to wrap around the frame and pull down snug. To make sure that this bead wears well for a long time, I always take a second pass back through the beads, crossing back over to the place where I started. And again, pull snug. Once you've gotten over to the other side, wrap around the frame again. If you were to try and add another row immediately right from where this wire starts, you can see that it would run into the beads that you've already strung. So you need to actually stitch the wire around the frame to move it over and position it for your next row. This will keep your wires and your beads from crashing into each other and keep your rows nice and straight and clean. I tend to leave a lot of space between the wraps and not coil them directly around the frame so that I can do it with less steps. As I'm stringing on the second row, pay attention to the fact that my 6mm beads are ending up on opposite corners from one another. This way you fill the space with just a little bit better and get it a little bit more full looking on the surface of the bead without having to change a lot of bead sizes to get it there. And again, just like on all my rows, I'm going to pass back through the beads one more time. If you catch your wire, which generally happens on the daisy spacers, stick your finger inside the bead and spin the beads around, and it normally helps the wire come up through the beads and come out to the other side. To change the direction of your wire so that you can go from working horizontally to working vertically in the bead, wrap up and around any corner. Wrapping the wire again into position for the row, and this way, voila, you have changed the direction that your wire is going, and now it's positioned to put a horizontal or a vertical row onto the bead. By wrapping up and around the corner, you can go from stringing your beads horizontally to stringing them vertically on the frame. To close the bead up and have it look nice so that you're not just wrapping a whole bunch of times around both of these wires with another piece of wire, I like to put a daisy spacer in so that it sits down in between the sides. And wrap that on there. I stitch it on just the same way I stitch on all the rest of the beads. And I usually continue up the seam to add the next one on. To finish off a wire when you reach the end of it, or in case you break it, trim to a little bit under 1/2 inch. Take your chain nose and pull the end around to make sort of a C shape with it. Once you've done that, you're going to finish it the same way you do any traditional wire spiral, which is hold it flat and continue to add just a little bit more wire on with each turnaround of your plier until you've spiraled up the whole piece that you've got left there. You don't want to leave too long of a piece to start with, or this spiral ends up being gigantic. Once you've beaded all 4 sides, it's time to add the caps. When you add these caps, make sure the flat side of the cap is on the sides of the beads and that the loop side sits across the corner on a diagonal. The easiest way to get your wire in and out is to actually form it into a little hook so that it goes into the bead and pops back out to the outside of the frame. And then just begin stitching. Everything is pretty much the same technique in this bead. It's really just sewing the pieces on. And the same goes for the cap. You don't need to put any more than about 1 or 2 stitches per loop on the cap, because by the time you've gone all the way around, there's no way it's going anywhere or coming off of the bead at all. Once you've added all of your beadwork and attached the caps, this is what your finished beads should look like, or something close to this. Here's a small grouping of finished beads. All of these use different types of beads or different mixes. This one's using some semi-precious and some crystal. This one is a mix of all different types of glass. And this one's all crystal. Notice the difference in the finished bead depending on what your bead choices are and what kind of colors you choose. I tend to work monochromatically so that the colors are in a grouping but the beads are all different. But here I've worked with a very, very shallow monochromatic palette, and you can see the bead looks much different when it gets finished if you have a little bit less texture in it. This is a large style finished bead, and you can see that this one features findings on the side in replacement of the beads. So you can substitute something like that. You want to make sure you pick out a finding that's large enough to actually sit on top of the frame material, so that you're not suspending it in between the frame wires. This bead is attached to the chain by running a head pin up through the holes in the bead caps and doing a wire wrap at the top to attach it to the chain. This small bead features pearls as the bead choice within the frame, and is more traditionally strung with a piece of flex wire running through the center that I've strung onto to finish up the chain. Thank you for coming to Wireframe Beads. I hope you enjoyed making your bead today, and I know it looks great because I've never seen one I didn't like.